right, this is the first lecture of Unit 2. It's Chapter 6, and it's over American imperialism. This is a time where the U.S. is expanding their power. They're taking overseas territories. They have a huge influence in the Caribbean and the Pacific, both economic, political, and with military motives. This is really imperialism. This chapter sets the stage for what will become the Great War, which most people know as World War I, because at the time we did not have World War II. So this is what we are going to discuss. All right, let me get the words up here. Okay, so looking at this by a global picture, the world of the late 1800s was being reshaped by a massive wave of imperialism. And if you can understand this wave, it's going to help explain why the U.S. expanded the way it did and why this imperialism that the world is doing, the major powers, will eventually plunge the entire world into World War I. So you first have the European imperialism. This is when the European countries, the European nations, are going into Africa, which is known as the scramble for Africa. So by the mid 1800s, European nations were in full exploration, expansion mode. They had already created colonies across the globe, but many of those colonies were lost during the American and Latin revolutions. So you have the European nations losing their colonies that they had, but you have industrialization coming up and all these technological advancements. So they need to replace these raw materials that they had gotten from their colonies overseas. So the Industrial Revolution is a major fact of why European imperialism began. And again, we're talking about European imperialism. The economic motive is the need for the raw materials such as rubber, oil, cotton, and metals. The colonies that the European countries had provided these raw materials and had also provided a market to sell them back to. Then you've got political moves. You have nationalism. It's exploding. Countries want to prove that they are the greatest country. They deserve to be the top power. They're expanding territories. But again, they have to expand into areas that they had not taken power over. And that's going to be Africa. The social motives, the justification is going to be social Darwinism. This is using Darwin's principles, which were applied to plants and species. Birds is what he did most of his theory on. And that there is a sense of adaptation. If a species did not adapt, they would no longer exist. Being that the top species, the most adaptable species, they would grow stronger, they would multiply, they would exist, and the weaker ones would not. So Herbert Spencer takes this biological theory and he applies it to society, which is where you get the social Darwinism. And it is the idea that the Europeans are superior to other countries and that we need to civilize them. We need to bring them into our Christian ideology, and we need to take over these countries and show them how to be Christian, how to assimilate more into the European culture. And social Darwinism becomes the justification to go in and dominate and take over these areas. Now, like I said before, they're going to go into Africa, and this is called the Scramble for Africa. And this is going to be between 1870 and 1890. 1884, the Berlin Conference was held. This is literally the European countries decide that we are not really doing this civilized. We're fighting amongst ourselves for which countries we want. So we're going to come together, have a basic little tea party, cut cake, and within ourselves, we're going to divide up Africa. They invite all the different European countries, except, of course, Africa. So this is known as the Berlin Conference, 1884. Okay, so that is Europe and what's happening in Europe. The United States isn't really involved in this. And we're not involved in taking over the Africa, which is in the Western Hemisphere, because of the Monroe Doctrine of 1823. And the Monroe Doctrine basically says, leave us out of your issues, Eastern Hemisphere. We're going to take care of the Western Hemisphere. We're going to be the sphere of influence. Africa's in the Eastern Hemisphere. We're just going to handle Latin America and the Caribbean. You stay over there, you deal with your hemisphere, and the U.S. will deal with the Western Hemisphere. And also a warning to them not to come over and mess with the Western Hemisphere. It was ours and we would handle it. Okay, so the U.S. is going to go after the Caribbean, the Pacific, Latin America, and East Asia. And this American imperialism is going to really shape the difference in these countries. All right, this is talking about Charles Darwin and Herbert Spencer, and I already really explained this to you, so we're not going to go over this again. Okay, this is the Caribbean, and again, this is in the Western Hemisphere. If you can see the Gulf of Mexico, the United States, you see Florida and Guatemala, Honduras. So this is our hemisphere, and this is where the U.S. is going to take over. So at this time, it's called the Banana Republic. And this is kind of referred to the Banana Republic from 1898 to 1917. Okay, so it's a region that is being dominated by the U.S. and some other foreign powers. And the Banana Republic is not its legit name. It's just kind of a nickname for it. Okay, so we're dealing with the United States, Great Britain, France, and the Netherlands, which is Dutch. And they had already had ports and strategic coastlines conquered. So we do have other countries involved in this. The nickname, because it says Banana Republic, it didn't come from just bananas alone. It came from the fact that foreign companies and governments controlled these different regions, and so they controlled the economics, the politics, and the resources. So if you look at the symbols, you will see that this area contained bananas, sugar, coffee, tobacco, and fish. And if you remember from any of our other lectures in 1301, the sugar fields were the absolute worst to ever work in. Okay, so after the Spanish-American War, the United States is going to gain a lot of these territories. They're going to gain Puerto Rico, they're going to have influence over Cuba, and they're going to actually become the dominant power in this area. All right, let me see if I can get this all up. Okay, there we go. All right, so the Spanish-American War. This is an important one. You are tested over this quite a bit. So what's happening is the United States steps onto the world stage at the end of the 19th century. They're stepping on it during a crisis fueled by the collapse in Spanish Empire. So Spain is still in this area in our Western Hemisphere. So Cuba has a rebellion, and this mysterious explosion happens on the USS Maine. We send over the USS Maine to start protecting that area. So by the late 1800s, Spain had been reduced to only a few overseas possessions: Cuba, the Philippines, and Guam. And Cuba was fighting fiercely for independence. They did not want to be under Spanish rule. They felt that Spanish rule for centuries has been very, very harsh. So, what happens with how we get to the Spanish-American War? Reports of Spanish brutality, including the use of concentration camps, this shocks Americans and stirs up a public sympathy, especially since we had so many U.S. businesses and had millions of dollars invested in Cuban sugar. So we're wanting to protect our economic investments. So tensions begin to escalate. There's a stolen de-loan letter, not sure I pronounced that right, which insults our president at the time, which was McKinley. So we are going to be outraged over that. And then at the same time, we have the USS Maine over in the Havana Harbor. So what happens is the USS Maine explodes with a fire. Now, historically, it has been a big debate as to was it the Spanish fault or was it just an accidental fire? But at this time, you have 258 sailors, who have been killed. So you have this big rally cry, remember the Maine, and we're going to blame it on Spain, and we're going to declare war on Spain April 25th, 1898. And like I said, later down the road, historians have questioned whether or not it was Spain that actually did this. Okay, so we declare war on Spain in 1898. And we promised through the Teller, T-E-L-L-E-R, amendment not to annex Cuba. We will not take control of Cuba. We're going to help Cuba because we have a large economic interest. We now have had our president insulted, and the USS Maine killed our sailors. And we're going to blame it, like I said, on Spain. Okay, so we tell Cuba we're going to help you, but in the Teller Amendment, we are not going to annex you. We're not going to take control of you. Then later, the Platt Amendment, P-L-A-T-T Amendment, ensures continuing U.S. influence. So later on, we decide, you know what? We're going to still kind of hang around and influence your decisions. So the war ends quickly with the Treaty of Paris in December 1898. And it strips Spain of Cuba, Puerto Rico, the Philippines, and Guam, and a few other islands. So this moment marks the birth of the United States as an imperial power, and it begins to raise some lasting questions about democracy, freedom, and Americans' role in this expanding imperialism, this expanding shape of global affairs. Okay, so let's talk about a few things that helped increase what was going on, kind of increase the fear and led things. So the next little column you have there is called yellow journalism. Yellow journalism, it's different than what we talked about with the muckrakers, who were insulted by being called muckrakers. They were journalists, and they were exposing Sinclair, the meat packing industry. Rios was exposing what was happening to the children and child labor. These journalists were telling the truth. They were reporting what people did not want to hear. Okay? Yellow journalism is different. It is taken a small fact, and it's just sensationalizing it, making it this huge, big deal, whatever will draw attention, kind of putting the blood in the water so the sharks will come. So that's the big difference between yellow journalism and muckrakers. They were telling the truth. Yellow journalism is not. It's exaggerating reporting. It's putting misinformation out there. And right now, this is being recorded in 2026. There's a lot of yellow journalism going on. All right, but you had major publishers like Joseph Pulitzer, William Randolph Hearst. they were large newspaper companies, and they found out, hey, this misinformation, it stirs up emotions and it really helps sales. So this is going to give America a very distorted view of what is happening in Cuba, and it's going to increase the anger, and it's just going to push the nation closer to the war. This is again the Spanish-American War we're talking about, and I'm explaining why yellow journalism was a factor in it. All right, so that is how yellow journalism, helps push the war. Okay, so let's talk about what happens after the war with America. If you see the locations on the map, you should see Cuba and Puerto Rico, Guam, the Philippines, and Hawaii. All right, so from just a minute ago, we talked about how the Spanish had lost Guam, Philippines, and Puerto Rico, and Cuba. So after the war in 1898, the United States is going to handle and take control of several territories, the Philippines and Guam, and we're going to take care of Puerto Rico. And we are still trying to influence Cuba. We're not taking control of Cuba. We have Puerto Rico, Philippines, and Guam, and we still have those. But we're also dealing with the open door policy to Japan and China. So with this expanded presence that the United States has, it opened up a huge opportunity to trade with Japan and China. These were two of the largest and most important markets in East Asia. American businesses, they're going to see just an enormous potential for the silk, the tea, and other industrial goods. Politicians saw the influence, and naval leaders see the strategic power of having control of this area. This matters because this shift is going to transform American foreign policy. The United States is going to begin to see itself not just as the Western Hemisphere power, but as the Pacific power, a nation with interests stretching all the way to East Asia. And this new role is going to shape a lot of the decisions that America makes in the decades to come. All right, Alfred Mahan. He is a U.S. naval officer. He is an instructor at the Naval War College. What he is famous for is his battles at sea. His book that he writes that changes the way that the Navy and the sea power works is called The Influence of Sea Power upon History. So it becomes a very influential work on military strategy, and it still is. So he becomes known for transferring not armies, not forts, but the Navy. The Navy's on the sea. He argues that the United States wants to rise in the world power and has got to think and use the past, what the great empires in the past have done, which is creating a bigger, more powerful Navy. You have to have battleships, destroyers. You have to have more firepower. You have to have overseas bases to place this firepower strategically around the globe. So you can't just depend on protecting coastlines. You have to control the sea. And again, if you remember a few minutes ago, we're talking about how the U.S. is trying to become not just the power of the Western territory, in the Western Hemisphere, but actually the whole Pacific. So he is known for creating the modern U.S. Navy. He's critical in his strategies on where to put naval bases, how to deal with foreign nations like Japan and Germany. He has a very good concept of how America needs to go forward to become this world leader and how the oceans need to be controlled. All right, we're going to go into Asian imperialism. And we've got the Boxer Rebellion and indirect and direct rule. Okay, so we're still in the late 1800s. Um, East Asia becomes a major target for the Western imperial powers, mostly the United States. And China found itself carved into what we called spheres, S-P-H-E-R-E-S, spheres of influence. And what a sphere of influence is, it's when another foreign country, another nation controls your trade, a lot of your local laws. They haven't taken control of your country. They're still over in their country, but they control what you are doing. So China remains technically independent. European powers and Japan were calling the shots, leaving the United States worried that it would be shut out of this enormous market that China was. So by 1890, the U.S. was this industrial giant, and they want new trade opportunities. They want new people to sell to, and they want new countries to get merchandise from. So the Secretary of State, John Hay, for the United States, he was very worried that Europe would divide China into very exclusive zones. And American businesses would lose access to millions of potential buyers. So they are going to create what's called the open door policy in 1899. This is in response to European spheres of influence trying to control China. So the open door policy insists that all nations should have equal trading rights in China and that no foreign power should close the door on anyone else. So no foreign power can control who trades with China. So this policy signals America's arrival as a major player in Asian affairs. And its determination to prevent China from being broken into colonies that the Western countries will rule. I'm sorry, the Eastern countries, because Asia's in the East. Okay, so Western imperialism, us, in Asia relies both on what we call indirect rule. That's where local leaders keep their titles, but they follow what the foreign orders say. So I'm going to leave the local leaders in control, but us, the U.S., will tell those leaders what to do. Direct rule is when the colonial officials replace the leaders. So that would be direct rule would be the U.S. send in U.S. representatives and replacing that country's rulers. Either way, the goal is the same. They want to extract raw materials like rubber, tea, and different minerals, and they want to funnel the wealth back to the Western factories. New military technology, which has like the rapid-fired machine guns, heavy armed naval vessels, this is going to allow the nations to enforce their will. And this is going to be called gunboat diplomacy. So we're going to go in to the Asian governments because we want them to open ports and accept our demands. But we're going to eventually add some pressure with the gunboat diplomacy. We're just going to have our major battleships hanging out close to them as we try and get them to open up our ports, just to let them know that there is another option, the gunboat, if they don't accept what we are telling them to do. And that's considered gunboat diplomacy. All right. So we have what's called the Boxer Rebellion. And what happens with the Boxer Rebellion? This is going to happen in 1900. So Boxer is exactly what it sounds like. There was a group of rebels, Chinese society, and they're known as the Boxers. They actually box. And they're going to rise up because they are tired of all this foreign influence. They have missionaries over there converting Chinese to Christianity. They have all these different diplomats. They are tired of the United States over in their business and Japan sending in troops. They're tired of these Western powers in their land. So what they're going to do is they're going to start killing all of the Americans and Western people from the West who are actually in their territory. And the U.S., during this uprising to crush it, the U.S. powers are going to send Japan in and different troops and U.S. troops in to handle this Boxer Rebellion. Afterwards, John Hay is going to warn that no nation should use the rebellion as an excuse to seize Chinese territory. That is going to reaffirm the open door policy, that all nations should have equal access, equal trade privileges with China. So the Boxer Rebellion revealed both China's desperation to kind of reset foreign domination and the determination that the Western nations, including the U.S., that they want to keep China open for trade. So this moment not only shapes U.S.-China relations for decades, but also marks another step in America's rise as a global power in the early 20th century. Okay, Roosevelt and the Big Stick in the Caribbean. This is a political cartoon, but let's look at it to think about what it means. So you have the image of President Theodore Roosevelt. He's striding through the Caribbean carrying a big stick slung over his shoulder. It's very bold, and it's letting foreign policy at the time know the big stick in the Caribbean, speak softly and carry a big stick. So Roosevelt loves this phrase. He said it to describe his approach to foreign policy. Use diplomacy first, but make sure everyone knows you have the power to back it up. So the cartoon, The Big Stick in the Caribbean, is the name of the cartoon. He's towering over all these other little regions, walking through the ocean with a massive club in his hand. The islands all look tiny, and he's basically letting them know that this cartoon is about the Roosevelt Colony, which, to the Monroe Doctrine, Roosevelt announces that the U.S. had the right to intervene in Latin American nations if their instability threatened American interests. So you have the big stick symbolizing the U.S. military, the growing sphere of influence that America is wanting over the Pacific. You have the growing influence of the U.S. Navy. Those are all Navy ships you see. And you have Americans' willingness to step into Caribbean affairs if needed. Okay, so we're going to look at the American in the Caribbean in 1901. This is after the Spanish-American War. So we're going to take control of the territories in the Caribbean. Puerto Rico is going to become a U.S. possession. It's a U.S. territory. It still is. Cuba became independent on paper, but the U.S. held indirect control through military occupation and later the Platt Amendment. Suddenly, the Caribbean Sea, once dominated by European empires, has a new major player, which is the U.S. So there's several reasons why the United States wanted to maintain influence in the region, and each one reveals how America was thinking about its future. They want hemispheric security. The U.S. wanted to keep European powers out of the Caribbean. This is the idea of the Monroe Doctrine, which warned Europe not to create new colonies in the Western Hemisphere. By 1901, the U.S. wasn't just warning Europe not to come over to the Western Hemisphere, it was actually enforcing it. You have the economic interest of the Caribbean, which is a valuable zone. It has agriculture products, it has sugar, it has huge markets. So the U.S. is also wanting to protect the trade and protect American wealth. After this, you have the need for a canal, which is going to be a canal through Central America, and it's going to change the way things are shipped. It's going to be much faster to move between the Atlantic Ocean and the Pacific Ocean, and that's going to be the Panama Canal. And the U.S. will build that for more stability and more influence in the Caribbean. So the Roosevelt Colliery, it's going to be, think of it as an update to the Monroe Doctrine. It adds a little bit stronger, bold statements to the Monroe Doctrine, which means that basically saying not only must Europe stay out of the Western Hemisphere, but the United States will step in if any nation or region becomes unstable. So it's more of just a warning. It's actually a declaration of authority. You have the big stick policy, speak softly, carry a big stick. We already discussed that. All of this matters because the United States is now a regional police power. It's shaping U.S. relationships with Latin America for decades. It's setting the stage for the construction of the Panama Canal, and it is taking control of strategic areas of the Caribbean. Okay, so let's discuss the Panama Canal. No, I think I have a picture up later. All right, so the problem is that to get around Latin America, South America, it is a huge area to go around. So we're basically wanting to create a shorter route between Atlantic and the Pacific. Okay, so Latin America at this time is really tied to the United States and Great Britain. So trade flowed through this region, but the huge problem was how much time and effort it took to sail all the way around South America. And not only was it a dangerous journey, it was a very long journey, like thousands of miles to reach Cuba. So a canal through Central America would change everything. So there's a narrow strip of land in Panama. It was the ideal place to cut a canal. The problem was that it was owned by Colombia, and Colombia was not interested in giving the United States control of the land needed for the project. So Roosevelt, Theodore Roosevelt, is your president at the time, and he in 1904 is going to support rebels who are in Panama. They want independence from Colombia. And when the rebels rose up, the U.S. Navy positions itself to prevent Colombian troops from stopping the revolution. In other words, the U.S. didn't just cheer from the sidelines, it protects the rebels. Panama declares independence, and they are no longer under Colombia. And the government quickly agrees, the Panama government quickly agrees, of course, to let the U.S. build the canal. Construction begins in 1903. It's going to take 10 years to build. There's a lot of issues they have with disease like malaria. They have landslides. They're dealing with intense heat. And at the time, it's a massive engineer challenge. But in 1914, the Panama Canal finally opens. It's a 50-mile shortcut connecting the Atlantic and Pacific Ocean, and it instantly transforms global trade and also military strategy. All right, guys, this slide was messed up. So hopefully it is correct now. So our last slide is talking about TAF and dollar diplomacy. What this is the president at the time is President William Howard Taft. His approach is using money versus what Roosevelt's approach was using military. So Taft believes that good foreign relationships were not just about treaties or threats. He felt that the best way to build strong relationships between other nations was to help other countries become stable, prosperous, and financially secure. In Taft's mind, if a country was economically strong, it would therefore be politically stable, and that stability would benefit all the countries involved. So dollar diplomacy was Taft's signature foreign policy. The idea is extremely simple. The United States would guarantee loans made to foreign countries, especially in Latin America, to help them develop. So instead of sending soldiers, the U.S. would send checks instead. So instead of battleships, we're doing investment. Taft hoped that by supporting economic development in Latin America, the United States would strengthen its own economic power. American businesses would gain new markets, Latin American nations would become more stable, and European powers would stay out of the region. So again, instead of using military like gunboat diplomacy, he is using what's called dollar diplomacy, money. Under this foreign policy, this idea of dollar diplomacy, the U.S. encouraged American banks and companies to invest in places like Nicaragua, Honduras, and other Caribbean countries. When those countries struggled to pay their debts, the U.S. stepped in to help. And in return for the U.S. stepping in to give them money and help, the U.S. gained influence over their governments, which, if you remember, is called a sphere of influence. So this is very different than Roosevelt's big stick policy because dollar diplomacy is more of a big checkbook policy. But both of these presidents had the same goal. And the same goal is to expand, in whatever means needed, America's power, especially in the Western Hemisphere.